So what does all this mean for a salesperson? Well, basically, if you don't know the person well, you should speak very sparingly on the phone. Avoid email at all costs and go for the face-to-face meeting. Now the reason for that is you communicate much more effectively face-to-face because you have body language, you have all the nuances of speech, and you have the words. Phone is the second choice because phone you're only getting the words as well as about half the speech because of the quality of phone conversation. And the last resort is email. So email, it's just the words. You're only communicating at 7%. And for a salesperson, that's just not enough. Now, if you know the person well, then you can relax a little bit. Obviously, you don't need to be meeting face-to-face all the time. In account management situations, that just wouldn't be scalable. However, pick up the phone rather than using email because you're going from 7% communication to something like 30% communication with the phone. So always choose the phone over email and only use email as your last resort. Okay, let's talk about basic body language in the context of business meetings. Now the important thing to understand is that a lot of body language comes from the animal kingdom. So height is a very important thing. Height usually is a way of showing dominance and submission. So for example, if you are to bow, bowing comes from very simply showing your submission to someone because you're lowering your height. So for example, in imperial times in China, instead of just bowing at the waist, the people going to meet the emperor would actually lay on the floor. Right, so that's very obvious that it's a sign of submission to the emperor. And if you look at the animal kingdom, for example, apes, when they approach the dominant male in that tribe of apes, they will actually approach lowering themselves with their hand upwards. And that brings me to the next basic body language, which is open hands. Open hands are basically a way of showing that you don't pose any threat. You have nothing in your hands, and also you just basically come in peace. So these are two important things to understand, how height and open hands influence that communication in body language during a sales meeting. So what does that mean for a salesperson going to their first meeting with a client? Now what's important is that you're always standing when you meet the person. Firstly, it makes it easier to maneuver around, which is important. But also, if you meet them sitting, immediately you're on the back foot because subconsciously you're in a submissive position compared to them because they're standing. So make sure you stand and meet them standing. And get as much height as you can. If you're a woman, make sure you wear heels to get that extra little bit of height. Now, obviously, if they're taller than you, you can't do much about that. However, when you're sitting, you're much, much lower than them. So that's not a good position to meet someone. So if you're waiting in a foyer or in a cafe, just make sure either you rise before they reach you or you're already standing. You know, just meet them out front standing rather than sitting down. That's important. The other thing I want to talk to you about is confidence. Now with confidence, in a body language setting, what that means is essentially it comes down to the amount of exposure of your vital organs. So for example, if I'm not confident, I'll be very covered, which means a lot of my vital organs will be covered. So for example, in this position, which is, I guess, turned away from you as well as covering my vital organs, the neck, the heart, the stomach, I'm communicating that I'm not confident. Now, confidence is essentially exposure of as many vital organs as you can. So for example, if I'm confident, I'll stand like this, for example, which exposes my neck, my heart, my stomach. So in a body language context, confidence is all about vital organs and showing them to the world, because essentially what you're saying is, I'm not afraid of attack. I don't care. I have no fear of being attacked, and therefore my vital organs are all exposed. And if you start to look at that, you'll pick it up quite easily. The other thing is, you've got to also be able to read that person's confidence level, because if they're subconsciously communicating that they're not confident, then you may want to make them feel more comfortable. And you can use height and the open hands and other various tools we'll talk about to make them more comfortable. So you need to read that in the other person as well. Okay, so let's talk about personal space. Personal space is a very complicated thing. So personal space, for example, it can vary whether the person lives in the city or the country. So for example, someone from the city is more comfortable with communicating at a shorter distance, whereas someone from the country, they will communicate at quite a longer distance. And you'll notice this if you travel between the country and the city. So it's important to keep that in mind, because if you encroach on someone's personal space, and that can be very variant on whether they're from city, country, and also the culture or the country they're from. If you encroach on that personal space, it will make them feel very uncomfortable. And you may want that if you're negotiating, but if you're meeting them for the first time, it's a very good idea to play it on the safe side. So if you don't know what their level of comfort is, just let them come to you. So walk up to them, put your hand out, and let them cover the rest of that distance. And they'll stop when they're comfortable with that personal space. And make sure you know at what point they stopped. Was it quite far away? Did they reach out with their hand? Or did they shake your hand at quite close distance? Keep that in your mind, because that is the kind of personal space you want to leave around them when you're communicating with them, if you want to make them feel comfortable. However, in a negotiating position, you may not want to make them feel comfortable. So you may get closer or you may get further. So it's just another tool to use. Okay, speaking of handshakes, when you meet them, a handshake, it doesn't seem very complicated, but because it's an element of body language, it can communicate a lot. Now, there's 3 types of basic handshake, a lot of different types of handshake, but essentially, if we're talking about submission and dominance, the overhand handshake. So if someone comes to you with an overhand handshake, that's a very dominant handshake. You would actually have to come in underneath and take that hand. So because you're underneath and they're above you, it's all to do with height, then essentially you're at a disadvantageous position. So what I would suggest, if someone comes to you with an overhand handshake, you don't want to start off in a submissive position. So you can either take their hand and turn it, or you can, if you're a lady, you can actually reach across with your hand over their hand and simply grasp the end of the fingers. So it's important because you haven't accepted a submissive handshake, especially if it's a man. So just keep that in mind. Okay, there's the other type of handshake. If someone comes to you with an underhand handshake, you've got to read into that. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Is that person not confident? Do they believe you're in a superior position? If I were you, I would accept it, or perhaps you may want to turn it back to a neutral position. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve at that particular meeting. And an equal handshake is simply one where you shake the hand, and neither hand is above or below the other. So as you can see, there's a lot of nuances in a handshake. Okay, other things to look for in basic body language are things like crossed arms. We covered that before. That's to do with vital organs and confidence. If you're going to a group of people, one of the obvious signs of where the focus of the group is is whether a person is facing, or how many people are facing a particular person. So if everyone's facing a particular person, it's very likely they will be the person of the highest authority or influence, right? So that's a good way to tell authority and influence. However, if you're not sure, then the best place to look at is the feet, because the feet are the hardest to control. So it's easy to control your upper body when it comes to body language. So especially women are quite good at controlling their body language, so they can control the head and the upper body. But if you look at the feet are usually a giveaway. So if you're walking up to a group of people, look at their feet. Look at the person with the most feet pointing towards them, and that will give you an idea of, in that group, currently where the influence and authority lies. And that's important for a salesperson to understand. Okay, so the other thing is something if you see during a meeting, and that's the hand supporting the head. That's not a good sign. That's obviously a sign of boredom. And that's very easy to read. I mean, the person needs support of their head because their head is feeling heavy, which means they're sleepy and bored. So if you see that, then you need to, mix up the pace, the volume. You need to be more dynamic. So that's definitely a body language cue that you want to be looking out for in a meeting with that person.